D&D. It's become popular with children anywhere from grammar school on up. Not so with a lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders.
The victim of a seemingly innocent game, Mazes and Monsters. Now, Mazes and Monsters is a fantasy role-playing game in which the players create an imaginary character. These characters are then plunged into a fantasy world of invented terrors. The point of the game is to amass a fortune without being killed.
I've come to accept an awful truth. These murders are ritualistic sacrifices. We've all heard about how satanic cults are spreading to our country like some disease. And Eddie Munson is the leader of one of these cults. A club, a harmless club. That's what they want you to think. But it's a lie. A lie designed to conceal the truth.
Oh, hi. I'm just doing some required reading. Not just because of this video, but I have a campaign that I really want to finish, and it's been a while since we've played. Anyway. Hello, my name is Chloe, and if you couldn't already tell, I'm a fan of Dungeons & Dragons. I'd say it's about 5 years since I became heavily invested in this franchise, but it already feels like it's been in my life for a lot longer. However, during the time of my investment into one of the most famous tabletop RPGs, there was always one part of its history that I always heard bits and pieces about: the Satanic Panic. So, as an excuse to do research on an important part of D&D history, I decided to create a video around the spooky season dedicated to a time that was quite terrifying for many. Now sit back, relax, grab your favorite candy or apple/pumpkin based fall treat, and let me impart my findings on why Dungeons & Dragons got caught up in this major phenomenon. Before I fully give my reasoning as to why Dungeons & Dragons became one of the many targets in this panic, I feel it's necessary to explain what Dungeons & Dragons is for those that don't really know. Dungeons & Dragons, commonly abbreviated as D&D or DND, is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game that primarily takes place in a medieval-based setting. In this game, there are two main roles a person can take. The first role is as the Dungeon Master, or DM, who serves as the referee that runs the game, creating the world for said game, and role-playing its inhabitants, non-player characters. The other role is the player, who plays a character that they create in said world. Most of the time, D&D is played in a group, and the group of players forms a party that can consist of characters of different races, classes, and backgrounds. And the overall goal of the whole game isn't to necessarily win, it's to tell a story and have fun. Unless you want to win. Hey, each player and role-playing group is different. The tabletop role-playing game, commonly abbreviated as TTRPG, was created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arnson and published by the company Gygax founded, Tactical Studies Rules, TSR, in 1974. The game developed due to their love of wargaming, specifically ones that simulate historical battles in American history, i.e. the Revolutionary War or Civil War. Eventually, the D&D creators were inspired to utilize works of fiction based within medieval and fantastical settings, primarily from works of Tolkien, into their own tabletop games, with Gygax creating Chainmail with Jeff Perrin in 1969, and Dave Arnson creating Blackmore in 1971. If this was in line with the main topic, I'd go over the fascinatingly messy timeline that is the development of D&D throughout the 70s to the 90s, but today's not that day. Even if I say the reason why Dungeons & Dragons was called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons throughout the 80s is due to Gygax and TSR letting go of Arnson, and the former not wanting to give the latter any revenue since the latter was co-creator. Messy, right? White men can create a cultural reset, but white men will always be white men first. Next definition. Similarly to D&D, I think it's best to also define what the Satanic Panic is. And to do that, we're going to consult the good old free resource, Wikipedia, because it can be used as a source since I'm not in school anymore. Take that, academia. According to Wikipedia, the Satanic Panic is defined as follows: a moral panic consisting of over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse, SRA, sometimes known as ritual abuse, ritualistic abuse, organized abuse, or sadistic ritual abuse, starting in the United States in the 1980s, spreading throughout many parts of the world by the late 1990s, and persisting today. In addition to defining the Satanic Panic, I'd also like to provide the definition of a moral panic, which, according to Simply Psychology, is a widespread fear and an often irrational threat to society's values, interests, and safety. Typically, a moral panic is most likely perpetrated by the news media, most times engaged by politicians, and can result in increased social control. This particular moral panic began in late 1980 with the publication of the book Michelle Remembers, written by the eponymous Michelle Smith and her psychiatrist and later husband, Lawrence Pasder. It follows Michelle recounting her traumatic experiences in satanic rituals that she was forced to attend through the practice of recovered memory therapy, which is a controversially and scientifically discredited form of psychotherapy, as well as hypnosis. Though many of the details in her accounts have been debunked over the years, it was still enough to ignite a moral panic in American citizens across the country. As mentioned in the definition, there were many allegations of physical and sexual abuse of children and adults alike, within the context of it being involved in satanic rituals. Wikipedia also mentions, in its most extreme form, allegations involve a conspiracy of a global satanic cult that includes the wealthy and powerful world elite, in which children are abducted or bred for human sacrifices, pornography, and prostitution. You know, I think that one documentary that I was shown in elementary school as a way to convince me and my classmates to not celebrate Halloween had something to do with the Satanic Panic. I don't remember the full details of it, but I do remember that there was an anecdote of a young girl getting abducted while trick-or-treating by an alleged satanic cult. It was enough to scare me because I didn't end up celebrating Halloween or going trick-or-treating more after that point, and I regret it. Anyway, now that you know what these terms are, let's go to the why. As I mentioned in my intro, I created this video with this burning question in mind. Dungeons & Dragons at a glance is just a nerdy little game with the intent to tell stories. So why in the 1980s did it get caught up in this panic? To answer this, I came up with two main hypotheses. Number one, D&D critics and skeptics, both in the ordinary and professional spheres, believed the game was the primary motive behind suicides/homicides amongst kids, who they presumed couldn't tell the difference between the game and reality, or felt kids were corrupted by the game. A major incident that first brought this belief to the public eye was the disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III on August 15th, 1979. Dallas was a gifted student who graduated high school at 14 and began attending college at Michigan State University at 16. Unfortunately, he had difficulties with his mental and emotional health, social life, drug abuse, and coming to terms with his sexuality. Because of these factors, he ran away with the intent of committing suicide. While searching fervently for him, Dallas's parents hired a private investigator by the name of William Deere to assist in the search. And in my humble opinion, Mr. Deere did a lot more harm than good in this investigation. A major thing to keep in mind is that Dallas only expressed interest in playing Dungeons & Dragons. He wasn't an avid player. However, after Deere learned about this, he took that mild interest and morphed it into Dallas's primary motive for his disappearance. The biggest clue in the search for Dallas was a network of steam tunnels he traveled through, starting from Michigan State University. These tunnels were the main location for students' live-action role-playing game sessions. While Dallas did participate in these LARP sessions on occasion, apparently the other players asked him not to come back due to their suspicion of Dallas being on drugs. With the knowledge of Dallas's interest and the LARP sessions that would occur in these tunnels, Deere concluded that Dallas psychologically broke, thought the game that he played was now his reality, and that the network of steam tunnels that he used to travel were a part of the world he played in. In addition, this led to Deere theorizing that he was either involved in or was a victim of a D&D related cult tasked with luring more young boys and men like Dallas. Eventually, after 2 failed attempts, moving from house to house, and taking a job in Louisiana for only 4 days, Dallas called Deere and was returned home to his family on September 13th, 1979. However, on August 16th of the following year, Dallas passed away due to a self-inflicted gunshot. 4 years after Dallas's passing in 1984, Deere told the story of his disappearance and his theories through his memoir titled The Dungeon Master. Though I didn't read Deere's memoir myself, it is discussed in the book I did read in research for this video, titled Dangerous Games: What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds by Joseph P. Laycock. In the section discussing the memoir in Dangerous Games' 3rd chapter, Laycock lays out Deere's theories, how he came to those theories, and debunks them. He also calls out the irony of Deere's claims that people could get lost in the fantasy of D&D by saying, quote, Deere did have a good imagination. In fact, the narrative he created about a man lost in a fantasy can be regarded as a form of projection. Dallas had not created the adventure Deere describes. It was Deere who had imposed a fantasy scenario onto real events, casting himself as the hero. In doing so, he became the first critic of D&D to engage in a form of corrupted play. End quote. Through press interviews around the time of Dallas's disappearance and his subsequent memoir, Deere was one of the primary contributors to the case being sensationalized by the public, and the increased stigmatization and skepticism that began in the 80s. However, while there was the belief of D&D being an initiator for a possible cult, there wasn't as much of a focus on it being in line with Satanism in Dallas's case. That is, until another leading case of a similar caliber came to light in 1982 with the passing of Bink Pulling. Similar to Dallas, Irving Bink Pulling II was a gifted student in school. He also passed away like Dallas through suicide via self-inflicted gunshot. However, unlike Dallas, Bink was actually an avid D&D player and would play after school. Hence why when he died, his parents, especially his mother Patricia Pulling, became adamant that it had something to do with the game. Allegedly, this began after an officer showed the Pullings several D&D materials in Bink's room, with a standout being a note found in one of the folders. It was a prop used in one of the sessions Bink attended, and it detailed a werewolf lycanthropy curse that his character received. However, Pulling came to the conclusion that Bink's suicide was linked to him believing he was actually cursed and evil. In press interviews, Pulling stated that Bink was a normal and well-adjusted boy, but his classmates said the opposite. Washington Post journalist Michael Isakoff mentions this in a 1983 article. Quote, classmates of Pulling yesterday described him as an unusually bright youth who was enrolled in the school's talented and gifted program for students with high IQs. They said, however, he also had trouble fitting in and became dejected when he was unable to find a campaign manager when he ran for school office. Shortly before his death, he wrote life as a joke on the blackboard of one of his classes, one classmate said. End quote. Another incident that personally stood out to me was the mention of him threatening to kill his sister Melissa, which she tearfully states in the 1985 60 Minutes segment discussing Dungeons & Dragons. I like to note that I'm not a therapist, but it is concerning to hear these things from peers and people his age and think that he was well-adjusted. Regardless of where this behavior came from, this only fueled the family's belief that D&D was the main cause of why he acted out in this manner. In response to Bink's death, the Pullings filed their first lawsuit against his high school principal for $1 million due to the school providing D&D as an after-school activity. Then they filed their second lawsuit against TSR for $10 million, since they, created the game. However, both suits were thrown out in court. And in 1983, this led Pulling to found a group called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, also known as BAD. BAD's goal was to spread the word about the dangers, immoral nature, and religious tone of Dungeons and Dragons, and its link to corruption and suicide, especially in young boys. And I think it's safe to say that throughout a good chunk of the 80s, this goal was pretty successful. Members of BAD didn't solely reside in the United States either. There were also members in Canada, the UK, and Australia. They were also successful in having D&D banned in schools across the US, and eventually were deemed consultants, especially Pulling, in cases regarding the occult. Thanks to Pulling and BAD's influence, subsequent suicides and homicides involving young boys and men as victims or perpetrators respectively during the Panic had D&D seen as a common motive. It didn't matter if it was an accident or purposeful. This panic-induced motive gave rise to a new tactic used in defense of men that committed homicide. The tactic was dubbed the D&D defense, meaning that the men that committed these crimes weren't solely responsible for their actions, but they were brainwashed through playing D&D and unable to distinguish between the game and reality. Despite it advancing BAD's agenda against D&D, it wasn't very effective in the court system and became less effective as the Panic declined. Number 2. Critics and skeptics of D&D thought of it as a supernatural and or religious cult used to lure kids into satanic rituals. Although this belief stems from fear and anxiety, I can agree that Dungeons & Dragons facilitates a discussion around and heavily references religion. In the section of Dangerous Games discussing the comparisons between Dungeons & Dragons and religion, Laycock states, quote, "There are 3 ways in which fantasy role-playing games may be usefully compared to religion. First, there are many elements of D&D that are substantively religious. That is, they concern morality, gods, rituals, and the supernatural. In many cases, these elements reflect the religious worldviews of the game's creators. Second, the most significant function that D&D shares with religion is the possibility of experiencing a more idealized time and place. Finally, by inhabiting another world, we are able to look back at our own from a new perspective." End quote. Since its inception and publication, religion has been a key component in the game, especially through its classes of clerics and paladins, which would not be as thorough if not for Gygax and Arnson's Christian beliefs and background. Despite this, the existence of devils, demons, and magic through wizardry/witchcraft was a cause for concern, especially in Christian communities. One example comes from the earlier days of the Satanic Panic, around the year 1980. According to Molly Ivins' New York Times article, there was a group of Christian parents in Heber City, Utah, that were against D&D as an after-school activity for gifted kids. Unlike William Deere's belief that the game could lead to psychological delusions, these parents were convinced that it would corrupt their kids due to their belief in it being supernatural and anti-religious. This led to a major back and forth between teachers and administrators who wanted to use D&D as a tool to help students' creativity against the parents that were adamant in their fears and disdain for it. A non-denominational Christian minister named Norman Springer had this to say in the article, quote, "Oh, it's definitely anti-religious. I have studied witchcraft and demonology for some years, and I've taught against witchcraft. The books themselves have been taken from mythology and from witchcraft, and they are filled with demonology, filled with pictures and symbols that you could find in any basic witchcraft book and use the same terminology. These books are filled with things that are not fantasy, but are actual in the real demon world and can be very dangerous for anyone involved in the game because it leaves them so open to satanic spirits." End quote. After several polarizing and explosive PTA meetings and discussions within the community, the school district eventually banned D&D as an after-school activity. Did it stop kids from actually playing the game? Absolutely not. Another prominent example comes from BAD. Again, in addition to the claims of D&D corrupting the minds of kids that can't tell the difference between game and reality, Bad also made similar claims about the corrupt supernatural, satanic, and religious undertones D&D allegedly contained. Most of these claims were in their self-published pamphlet, Dungeons & Dragons, Witchcraft, Suicide, Violence, which was written by Pulling alongside Mary and Pat Dempsey, the latter of which was a co-leader of Bad alongside Pulling and Thomas Radecki. For the sake of brevity, I'll go over certain parts of the pamphlet that highlight these claims, but I'll have a link in the description so you can check it out on Internet Archive. On page 5, they state that witchcraft is a form of religion and mention the other forms of occult religion, i.e. voodoo, are taught in D&D. In the last paragraph, they also mention that the game teaching these occult religions violates the Supreme Court ruling of being taught in the public school system. Most of the pamphlet lists out some of the rules, spells, and abilities from the Advanced Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Page 6 and 7 discuss spell preparation. Pages 8 through 17 make side-by-side comparisons between spells and other magical effects and text from non-fictional books that discuss these aspects being featured in witchcraft. Similarly, pages 8 through 25 discuss aspects of death, sacrifice, and revival being used in D&D and reference different non-fictional books discussing these features. From pages 26 through 30, they highlight religious themes found throughout D&D. And finally, from pages 31 through 38, they discuss many negative excerpts, i.e. death, that have been strewn throughout both the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. Also, to tie it back in with the first hypothesis, there was a section that highlighted the victims that were, quote, all heavily involved in Dungeons and Dragons, end quote, school boards across the country that plan on banning or have banned D&D, and statements from people expressing their disdain or enjoyment for this game. While researching and writing the script, I did have a bit of a challenge separating these hypotheses because of how intertwined they were. Both mention parents who, at the heart of it, were either grief-stricken by the sudden loss of their children, or concerned that this new game was going to corrupt their child in some way. And while I do sympathize with parents like Patricia Pulling to an extent, it is disheartening to see how much they demonized a game that was reliant on imagination and creativity, which led to players, especially young players, being ostracized and bullied for years. Although there was an increased amount of fear from both the religious and secular public, there was still a massive intrigue for Dungeons and Dragons. So much so that the game sold incredibly well. For example, around late 1979, after the incident with Dallas Egbert began circulating around the media, there was an increase in basic set copies, which went from 5,000 to over 30,000. And by the end of 1980, Gygax and his team at TSR earned around $8.7 million. This further increased after the passing of Bing Pulling in 1982, in which they earned $22 million from product sales. But because of how intense the panic became after that point in time, it was likely that TSR wanted to figure out a way to appease parents that were apprehensive about the game. So they started pushing toward showcasing how beneficial D&D was for young players. Starting in 1983, they placed the following text in the Player's Handbook. Quote, "Players are not characters. It is important to remember that the player and the character are two different persons. The more those two are kept apart, the better your games can be." End quote. Joyce Brothers, a well-known psychologist, writer, advice columnist, and TV personality, was hired by TSR to promote D&D as a game that was influential to the development of young players' creativity, intellect, and emotions. Due to its possible educational benefits, she recommended it as an extracurricular activity for students. She also thought it would be a better way to steer kids away from drugs. Gygax was invited to speak at teaching conventions to discuss D&D, and D&D clubs were made as extracurricular activities in libraries and after-school programs, which subsequently got students to read more challenging literature. Though that didn't last long, since they again banned it as an after-school activity and from libraries in numerous parts of the US afterward. Unfortunately, the positive spin wasn't appealing enough, so to further crack down on it and make it less demonic and occult to consume, TSR Hobbies eventually removed any aspects or references to demons, devils, or any other supernatural creatures in their second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in 1989. The creatures of demons and devils still technically existed, but were referred to by different names that didn't start with D. Demons were changed to fiends and or Tanari, and devils were changed to Batezu. Eventually, as the panic was dying down and Wizards of the Coast bought over the rights to Dungeons & Dragons in the late 90s, the topics of devils, demons, and hell were reincorporated as terminology in the books that followed. This was further pushed in D&D 3rd edition, where they were the most explicit with this terminology alongside other topics that were considered taboo discussions during the duration of the D&D side of the panic. In this segment, I wanted to mention some works of fiction that heavily discussed the D&D portion of the Satanic Panic. Most of the works that I will be looking into are primarily based on some of the different cases that were covered throughout the panic. Mazes and Monsters is a novel written by Rona Jaffe and published in 1981. The made-for-TV film adaptation was released the following year in 1982 and was Tom Hanks' first lead role. Both the book and the film are based on / inspired by the inaccurate story following the disappearance of Dallas Egbert, who I talked about earlier in the video. The story follows 4 college students, JJ, Kate, Daniel, and Robbie, played by Hanks, who are all fans of the tabletop RPG, Mazes and Monsters. JJ and Robbie in particular are the most based around Egbert. The former attempts suicide in a cavern, which he later decides to have as a location for his friends to play a LARP campaign instead, while the latter starts to believe he is actually his character and living in the world of Mazes and Monsters. Though the book and the film were intended as a cautionary tale and succeeded in increasing anxiety toward the game it was based on, it ironically contributed to the increasing sales of Dungeons & Dragons products at that time. Skullduggery is a Canadian horror film directed, produced, and written by Oda Richter. Unlike Mazes and Monsters, the story is more loosely based on Dallas Egbert's story. It still follows a group of college kids playing a TTRPG, and one of the kids gets too invested to the point that he's unable to discern between game and reality. This time around, the Dallas of this story is Adam, a descendant of men cursed by the devil, and is also cursed to believe that he's a warlock on a quest to murder others, causing him to become a serial killer in the process. In this film, there was more of an emphasis on Dungeons & Dragons, or rather the game that was based on it in this film, being used as a tool for the devil or using it for demonic purposes. Dark Dungeons was a 1984 comic tract written and drawn by Jack Chick. The story depicts the Dungeon Master as a cult witch figure named Miss Frost, who coaxes Debbie, a college student and Dark Dungeons player, into a cult to learn real spells based on the ones in said game. However, after her friend Marcy passes away due to her character dying in the game, Debbie begins to feel conflicted about whether or not this is something she wants to do. Then, she turns to Christianity as a way to relieve herself from the occult game. The comic is likely based on the passing of Bing Pulling. Aspects of the story, particularly involving Marcy, can be compared to what occurred during the case, such as something harmful occurring to the person's character, and the person leaving a suicide note behind that someone close to them sees after they've already passed away. Out of all the content that's being highlighted in this segment, Chick doesn't shy away from using the pro-Christian perspective to push the anti-D&D and anti-occult rhetoric discussed throughout the Panic. There are constant references to, or reciting of biblical scriptures, and an end card that provides steps to grow in Christianity and also further advertises Chick's works. Honor Thy Mother and Cruel Doubt were two made-for-TV adaptations based on true crime novels surrounding the murder of Lieth von Stein in 1988. To briefly summarize that incident, one night while they were asleep, Lieth and Bonnie von Stein were attacked by a masked assailant who killed Lieth while Bonnie survived. The assault and murder were allegedly orchestrated by Chris Pritchard, Bonnie's son and Lieth's stepson, who apparently had an antagonistic relationship with the latter. Also allegedly involved in the murder were Pritchard's friends Neil Henderson and James Upchurch. Although all three were implicated and convicted in the early 90s for a motive that didn't involve Dungeons & Dragons, it was heavily spotlighted in the media because they were avid players of the game. Honor Thy Mother was a TV film directed by David Green and based on the novel Blood Games by Jerry Bledsoe. And Cruel Doubt was a two-part miniseries directed by Yves Simoneau and based on the novel of the same name by Joe McGinnis. All of these works are told in a biographical, based on a true story sort of way, but with an extra emphasis on the implications that Dungeons & Dragons, amongst other media, are the driving factors behind Pritchard's motive to plan these murders. Alongside its science fiction / supernatural elements, Dungeons & Dragons plays a huge part in the Stranger Things series, with the upside-down creatures and villains being named after creatures and characters in D&D, and the personality and growth of some of the characters in the franchise. So it isn't surprising, with a show being set in the 80s in a fictional and presumably conservative town, that the Satanic Panic was covered at some point. One of the many plot lines in the latest season of Stranger Things follows this panic in the town of Hawkins, Indiana, where most of the characters reside. The year is 1986, and there's a disdain for Dungeons & Dragons in the American public, which is significantly increased by the mysterious deaths of high school students thanks to new main antagonist Vecna. Character newcomer Eddie Munson, who is everything a conservative Christian fundamentalist mother would hate, is the primary suspect due to being the last person to see the first victim of Vecna's alive, and is the dungeon master for the D&D club, the Hellfire Club, which people are starting to increasingly think is a murderous cult. Stranger Things is different from all of the media that I previously covered in this segment. First, it highlights a time in history instead of contributing to a time in history. Second, it's not really based on a singular case, but is influenced by several. Third, it isn't written as a cautionary tale or to scare people away from D&D. Finally, it looks at it from the perspective of characters that are ostracized by others to a harmful degree because of the panicked perception of D&D. To end this segment on a tangent, I'd like to shout out my friends for forcing me to binge this show in order to catch up to season 4. I probably wouldn't have made this video. I also wouldn't have gotten this shirt. Around the late 90s to the early 2000s, the Satanic Panic and public disdain for Dungeons & Dragons began to die down and shift toward video games, especially those violent in nature. Eventually, in the mid to late 2010s into the 2020s, Dungeons & Dragons became even more successful than before, thanks to the rise of actual play via podcasts and web series, both in live stream and edited formats, and less negative portrayals in the mainstream media. But to get sentimental for a moment, I do believe that Dungeons & Dragons can influence the reality of its players. Not in the way that William Deere or Patricia Pulling believes it, but in the way that I've seen it in the ever-growing tabletop community. In more present times, D&D can serve as an outlet for players to process things in their lives, challenge themselves to work on something they're not the strongest at, or pay homage to a person that they love and has impacted them. Regarding this topic and its likeness to religion, Laycock says,
quote, "Fantasy worlds create an additional mental space from which gamers can step back and reflect on what reality is. In this sense, fantasy role-playing games have some of the same transformative power as religions. Like religions, the imaginary worlds of role-playing games have an ability to influence how gamers order their world, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in radical ones. The beyonding achieved by constructing imaginary worlds empowers players to reorder the world in ways that were previously unimaginable and unthinkable." End quote.
As I mentioned earlier in the video, the goal of Dungeons & Dragons is to tell stories. And one thing that has been proven time and time again is that storytelling, especially collaborative storytelling, is capable of bringing people closer together. The reason I made this video outside of what I also talked about earlier is that I wanted an excuse to learn about a time in D&D history that I didn't know much about. I've heard bits of the topic here and there, but never really understood why people thought of it in such a way. However, after learning about the components that contributed to the panic, stories of kids like Dallas and Bink make me sad and frustrated. As a person who struggles with my mental health pretty often, I can sympathize with these kids who, at the core of it, were really struggling and their families were likely unaware. And what frustrates me is that not only stories like theirs are misinterpreted by both the public and the media, but it caused this game to be misunderstood and blamed for something that didn't have anything to do with the source of these kids' declining mental health. At the same time, I'd like to preface that I don't want to harshly criticize these grieving parents either, because parents are people and they can only know so much of what their kids tell them. In all honesty, as I did research for this video, I realized that there are a lot of nuances when talking about the D&D section of the Satanic Panic. Yes, I will admit that I do have a major bias toward Dungeons & Dragons because I did say at the top of the video that I love this game despite its many flaws. But again, this allowed me to learn that there was so much more to this time in D&D's history. And I hope that you come out of this video learning a little more about it too. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching or listening. Don't worry, I know y'all exist. Also, if there is some information that I've missed, I do apologize. This script is already 15 pages, and I know it's going to be a bit of a lengthy video if I write any longer. Also, I'm finishing up this recording around 4 in the morning. I started recording around 8 p.m. I don't want to do any longer than this. Anyway, subscribe for more content whenever I decide or have time to post any. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Also, if you want to see or hear more from me, check out my artwork or any memes that I create or repost. I have my Twitter and Instagram all under the name The CC Nerd as screenshots here or linked in the description. I also have a link tree if you want to see all my social media in one place. Have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, night, or whatever time you choose to be awake, and I will see you all in the next video. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll get back to prepping my campaign.